Changes, a Generation X based fic. Chapter 2. First Impressions. After the meeting with the students, time seemed to fly by as the students helped prepare things for the new student. Some of the students worked to get a room together as others worked to prepare a small welcome party, as well as other things needed for the new mutant to prepare for life at the school. Part of that was a tour of the facilities and familiarizing them with the foes they might encounter. Once everything was underway, Sean got in his car and had made his way to Logan International Airport. During the drive there, Sean had hoped there would not be another incident with M-Plate. Last time that had happened, the others had arrived just in the nick of time. This time, because of the young man's request, he hoped M-Plate wouldn't show up, since it was just him and the new mutant. He tried not to think of what could go wrong now, but the thoughts kept nagging him. To try and take his mind off it, he thought about all the things he had seen. One of them being a limo waiting as he entered. He wondered if it had been for someone important, and then remembered that it didn't look like it was in good shape. He hoped whomever the limo was for wouldn't be upset about its state. As he entered the airport, he started to think back to the last time he had been here to wait for a student. Like then, he had come alone to escort a new student to the school, except that time had quickly turned into a disaster. He chanced a quick glance around, not sure what to do if he did see M-Plate. He did have a direct line to the school, so that the others could do what they could to get here. He just hoped that would be avoided this time. He was broken out of his thoughts when a voice came over the loudspeaker. Flight 341 from Newark is now arriving at Gate 12. He started in the direction of that gate, certain that was the plane the new student would be on. As he neared where everyone was leaving the plane, he started to hope again that M-Plate wasn't around. He recalled what he had heard about the boy's powers, and was reminded of the disaster that could cause. He snapped out of that thought when he saw a young man leave the plane. The man was dressed in black and was carrying a carry-on bag. The man had to be around 21 years of age, and his actions told him that he was looking for him. Sean raised his hand and noticed the lad saw the movement. This was the sign that the new student had arrived. Richard Cale started heading towards the gentleman who raised his hand. Judging by the slight goatee, red hair, and the Celtics jacket, it had to be the man he spoke with on the phone, Sean Cassidy. Looking at the Irishman, he wondered what the man's powers might be. He had to be a mutant since he was the head of Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters. However, those powers the teacher had didn't matter to him, since he was sure he'd to find out in time. As he neared the teacher, he shifted his carry-on bag, which contained a few clothes, a book or two, and something from his previous school. As he did that, he noticed something that made him worry. A hole was starting to form on his hand, and it had teeth in it. He tried to stay calm, since it meant another mutant was nearby. He was certain he wasn't close enough to Sean for his powers to lock on to his. That meant only one thing. Another mutant was nearby, one he couldn't see. One that maybe didn't want to be seen. He picked up his pace, noticing the hole was disappearing, and quickly headed towards the teacher. As he neared the teacher, he quickly said, "Sir, as much as I would have liked spending a few minutes here chatting, I think it would be best to hit the road." He was glad when the teacher fell in step with him, but kept a slight distance. However, he could hear concern in the man's voice. "What about your luggage? Don't you need to pick it up?" Richard quickly adjusted the bag again, hinting to it. "All in hand, sir. Now let's get out of here." He chanced a quick glance behind him, but still saw no sign of the mutant he had detected. He hadn't picked up on anything else, but it gave him a bad feeling. He realized his concern must be showing as Mr. Cassidy looked back as well, and then asked rather softly, "What's wrong, lad?" He glanced back, noticing the teacher was staying close enough to be heard, but out of the range of his powers. As they neared the door, he responded to the question. "I'll tell you when it's safe. I just have a bad feeling that someone or something was waiting for me in there." He was glad that the issue wasn't pressed. The only thing that mattered now was getting away from the airport. The two left the airport and quickly got into the car. He was thankful when Mr. Cassidy pulled away and they were on the road. He took a calming breath and watched the scenery pass. After a few minutes, he realized that he had forgotten his own precautions and had gotten in the front of the vehicle, which meant his power would have latched onto Mr. Cassidy's. He looked over at Mr. Cassidy and noticed the teacher was glancing in his direction while still driving. He knew the teacher was wondering what had spooked him. He was even wondering when the question would come. In fact, he wasn't surprised when the man finally asked a question. "So, lad, could you tell me what that was all about?" He sighed, trying to think of the best way to answer the question. He knew it would sound odd when he finally answered, since he wasn't sure what traits of Mr. Cassidy would be coming through. Finally, he took a deep breath and finally answered. "'Twas about me mutant ability kicking in. I think another mutant had been there, and they may have been up to something." He quickly clapped his hand over his mouth, realizing he had spoken in a perfect Irish accent. When a shocked look came over Mr. Cassidy's face, he realized he wasn't the only one surprised by the accent. After a moment of awkward silence, he realized Mr. Cassidy had realized what had happened. "I take it your ability has latched on to me." Richard meekly nodded and then said, "If you wouldn't mind, and could pull off at a clearing, I can show you a bit about me power." He was thankful when Mr. Cassidy nodded, and eventually pulled the car over near a clearing. They both got out of the car and walked into the clearing, making sure to stay a bit out of sight of the road. After a moment, Richard walked to the center of the clearing and looked at Mr. Cassidy. He closed his eyes for a moment, focusing on the ability he had latched on to. He felt something odd in his throat, as if something was different with his vocal cords. He then said, "I take it your power is linked to sonic screams." "Aye, it does." With that confirmation, Richard let out a scream and was surprised that he had found the right pitch to not only emit the scream, but also elevate into the air. As he did so, he noticed the shocked look on the other man's face, which was confirmed when he spoke. "So that's what you mean by mimicking other mutants. How long will you have that ability?" Richard had to think about that. Ever since he learned of his ability, he always tried to minimize extended contact with other mutants, which was hard given his hometown. What he did learn, however, he told his new teacher. "From what I have learned, I can usually hold an ability while I'm in close proximity with a mutant, and for about half that time after we distance ourselves. He noticed Mr. Cassidy nod in understanding. I see, so you can basically determine how long you hold a power. And no one could force an ability on you while you hold that power? That, I bet, could be handy. He shook his head as he started to bring himself back to the ground. Not really. I had the fortune to find out from another mutant that if I hold an ability for about a week, I'd keep that ability for the rest of my life. Before he had touched ground, however, he lost the sonic scream ability and dropped the remaining distance. As he landed, without injury, he watched as the teacher started to step forward but then stopped. I take it that's why you want to avoid contact or close proximity right away. He nodded, taking a few slow steps at first, as Mr. Cassidy started to head to the car. Indeed, in cases of close contact, there have been times when the other mutant had inadvertently caused my abilities to activate. In those cases, I usually have a brief headache as their personality asserts itself with the power. However, some of those who have had traumatic events, the signs are more painful and obvious. When they had reached the car, he noticed that Mr. Cassidy had opened the back door of the car, and then headed back to his seat behind the wheel. So is that what had happened at the airport, which spooked you? As he got in the car, he shook his head. No, what had happened there was different, and something about it made me worry. It's part of the reason why I wish to keep my distance a bit the first few days. Let them all get to know the real me first. As the car started to move again, he looked out at the scenery and wondered what the new school would be like. However, his thoughts were interrupted when the teacher spoke again. By the way, lad, you never told me your name on the phone. He blushed for a moment, realizing now that he still had not told the man his name. I'm sorry. With all that had happened, it slipped my mind. My name is Richard Cale. My family came from England. He noticed that the teacher looked at him via the rearview mirror. Sort of an automatic response when you say your name? Well, if it makes you feel more comfortable, you may call me Sean. Now, I do hope you enjoy excitement, because I'm sure you'll see your fair share at the school. He let a slight smile cross his face. That's fine. I just hope I have some time to rest first before the excitement starts. He then returned his gaze back to the window and went back to his thoughts. Unfortunately, those thoughts went to the presence at the airport. He had been lucky to dodge the topic now, since it was disturbing. However, what was more disturbing was the fact that there was something familiar about that presence. He then thought about how good his luck had been going lately. He quietly sighed, realizing that it had been going right for a while. It meant that sooner or later, his luck would run out. He also hoped that when it did, it would not affect any of the new friends he was going to make. Jubilation Lee sat quietly on the steps leading to the main door. She wasn't thrilled to be sitting there, since she didn't have good news to tell Sean. The whole time since Sean left to get the new student, she had been searching high and low for penance. It had to be one of the things that penance was very good at. When the silent mutant didn't want to be found, no one could find her. Of course, if she had been a captive of M-Plate for who knows how long, she'd hide all that she could too. She stood up when she saw Sean's car coming to a stop in the driveway. She watched as Sean got out of the front, and from the back, a guy about Jono's age came out. She studied him for a moment, noticing his black outfit, black bags, and glasses. And only one word came to mind about him: nerd. The guy appeared to be a stereotypical nerd. Her thought changed, however, when he spoke. Wow, looks like something out of the Midnight Movie. She did a quick double take as the words registered. There was only one movie she was aware of that it could be. It was one of her favorite movies, if not her all-time favorite. In a brief moment, she forgot all her preconceptions about this guy and the problem penance and shouted, "Hey, do you mean Rocky Horror?" She noticed that Sean finally noticed that she was standing there. She could tell he was surprised to see her standing there, especially since she wasn't supposed to meet the new student until later. She meekly smiled when Sean spoke to the new student. "Looks like you'll get to meet one of the students a bit early. This is Jubilation Lee. Seems you must have found a common thread with her already. Is your power locking in on her?" She watched as he shook his head, and then extended his hand in her direction, and he smiled in almost the same way as the character whose line he spoke next. "Hi, I'm Brad Majors." She almost wanted to respond like the audience did at the movie, but quickly started to laugh. As she laughed, she noticed the new student turned to Sean and said, "I always knew how to make people laugh." After a moment, she managed to stop laughing and called over to her teacher. "Sir, can I talk to you for a moment?" She was certain that what she had to talk about was something they didn't need the new student to overhear at the moment. She waited until he walked over to her, and was thankful when he quietly asked, "What's wrong, lass?" Nerves started to creep up on her, knowing he would not like hearing what she was about to say. "It's about Penance, sir. I wasn't able to find her. I think she may be keeping to the shadows. I'm hoping she isn't nearby, but since she hasn't been told about the new student." She watched as her teacher looked around for a moment, bringing his gaze to the new student. "Well, if she would be nearby, Richard would have noticed her. His power would have kicked in." She blinked for a moment, realizing what Sean had said. She then looked at the new student again. "Is that his name, Richard? Or does he prefer Rich?" She watched as Sean nodded. "Aye, that's his name, Richard Cale. And his ability is as he described it and a bit more. If he holds an ability for about a week's time, he'll keep that ability and personality. He even inadvertently mimicked mine." She heard him give a slight chuckle with his next statement. "I had a perfect Irish accent when he did it." She raised her eyebrows and then looked at the new student again, as a thought crossed her mind. "I sure hope he doesn't do physical changes as well. That could be awkward." Her mind went to images of Jonathan and Angelo. However, she thought of how awkward it would be if he was near Monet and physically changed into her figure. She noticed as Sean shrugged and then responded, "I don't think that's a problem, but I'm not sure. However, there was something that worried him at the airport. He said that there was a mutant in the area, and it must have spooked him. He had us get out of there in a hurry, and he forgot about his own safeguards." Instantly, Jubilee's mind went back to thinking Emplate was there, just like Jonathan's arrival. That's not good. She saw her teacher nod in agreement. "Indeed, I want whomever is going to show him the computer to make him familiar with the files on known enemies. This way, he'll know who to avoid, and maybe we'll know who was waiting for him." She nodded and remembered who had gotten that task. That would be Monet. They may not go over well if he thinks Emplate That may not go over well if he thinks Emplay was there. Her teacher nodded again. Indeed. Now, was there another reason why you were waiting here? She nodded, and he guessed correctly. I take it you are showing him his room. She nodded. Yes, sir. I also had a few questions for him. Mainly curious about how his power worked. She waited as Sean turned to Richard and said, Well, Richard, Jubilee will show you to the room you will have here. After that, we will formally introduce you to the rest of the students. She watched as he nodded and gave a slight salute, but kept a smile on his face as he said, You're the boss. Again she laughed and waited until he neared. When he was close enough, she started to lead him towards the boys' dorm. As they walked, she said, This way to the stately accommodations of Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. I hope a lot of action doesn't bother you, since you may see a good deal of it here. She glanced back and noticed that while they were still walking, he was still about 5 feet behind her. She tried to slow down, but he also slowed down. Hey, you don't have to stand so far away. I don't bite. She felt a bit at ease when he smiled. I never thought you did. I'm just trying not to let my ability latch onto yours. If I get any closer, I'll start mimicking your powers, and I might find out some things you don't want known. On occasion, I've seen deepest fears and deepest secrets. Need I go on for now? Jubilation shook her head as they entered the door and headed for the room that had been set aside for Richard. I get the point. So, you could use that power to find out about other people? If that was the case, maybe he was the way they could interact with Penance and find out more about her. He nodded and spoke as they neared the room. I could. However, I can also use the powers of a mutant against them. She then watched as he thought about it for a moment. Not a pleasant thing to think about. But I only did it once or twice, since I was in control of the power. She gave him a look at that last statement. It had seemed a bit odd that he would mention that, and it sparked her curiosity. Wait a minute. What do you mean by that? She realized she must have hit on a touchy subject as he gave her a look and said, Can I explain that later? I do want to get settled in a bit before I have to meet people. For a brief moment, she could have sworn he was about to tell her to mind her own business. But in the moment she saw it, it disappeared. She then looked at the door they had just reached and said, That's fine. Besides, this will be your dorm room. She went to open the door and then paused. Something seemed odd, and that could only mean one thing. Angelo and Everett had set up a joke. Most likely it was something harmless for the new student, but there was no telling what it was. Was it a bucket of water set to fall when the door was opened, or something else entirely? Before she could tell if it was safe or not, she watched as he walked over to the door. She stepped back and waited for a moment, as she noticed he had paused. In an instant, she watched as instead of opening the door, he kicked it. Just as the door opened, she saw him jump back, and almost like she suspected, a bucket of water came crashing down. After the shock of the stunt wore off, she watched as he looked at her. So that's what you thought might happen. She blinked and gawked at him in utter disbelief. What do you mean by that? How did you even... She closed her mouth and then looked at how near he was to her. She hadn't even realized he had gotten close enough for his powers to lock onto hers. She gave a meek smile and stepped back. Guess I got too close. He felt better when he smiled. She felt better when he smiled. Not a problem. I was the one who closed the distance, so I was in control. I take it there are some practical jokers here. She nodded, feeling a little better about the situation. Yes, that would be Everett and Angelo. You'll get to meet them in a bit. In fact, I think you'll have to meet them very soon. We have to get to the auditorium. You better just put your stuff down and we'll go." She watched then as he did so, and quickly dashed out of the room. She then led him out of the boys' dorm and to where the auditorium of the school was. Emma Frost stood on the floor right in front of the stage, as the new students stood on the stage itself. She watched as all the students settled into seats, noting that the youngest ones were in the front. They were also still talking, most likely trying to figure out something about the new student. After a moment, she cleared her throat. uh, all right, students, if we can be quiet for a moment. I'm sure you'll find out about our new student. Let's give him some respect and allow him to tell us about himself." She hoped her words would help drive home how serious this matter was, since she was sure the business suit she wore would also do the same thing. Once everyone was quiet, she glanced over at Richard and nodded. "Now, tell us a bit about yourself and your powers." She then started to mentally monitor his mind. She did carefully so he wouldn't suspect, but her reasons were not about him, but about penance. No one had been able to locate the silent mutant yet, and given the young man's powers, no one wanted her appearance to take him by surprise. She then watched as he looked out at the students and smiled. She could tell by the smile that he was very nervous about this. "Well, first off, my name is Richard Cale, but it's all right if you call me Rich. I actually prefer it. Years ago, I discovered I had the ability to fully mimic a mutant. In fact, it was not much of a problem until recently." She watched as Paige Guthrie stood up and asked a question she was sure was on everyone's mind. "When you say mimic, exactly how much of a mutant do you mimic?" She noticed that everyone started to murmur, as if they had all thought the same question. She waited a moment as she looked down for a moment, as he looked down for a moment and then said, "Well, definitely powers and some physical traits. The stronger ones tend to show more if the mutant closes the distance that triggers the power. I can learn things about the mutant, including their secrets and fears. Also, some physical changes can occur." She raised an eyebrow after hearing that, and wondered what the first encounter with Jonathan Starsmore or Angelo Espinosa might be like. She then noticed Monet St. Croix was speaking. "And what about flaws? Do those come through as well?" She could tell Monet was speaking in a condescending way, which she hoped wouldn't irk the new student. She watched as he smiled in response to the question. "Personal flaws with abilities usually show up when I'm not in control. As for personal flaws, they usually show up no matter what, but are more prominent when there is physical injury or severe trauma." She then watched as he lowered his head for a moment, as if in thought. "At least that's what I'm told. I'm not sure if I had shown those or not." She noticed Monet had some questions, still had some questions, especially as the Algerian girl asked another, "What about psychological problems?" "I don't think anyone here can say we are not free of those problems." Emma was impressed as the young man took a step back and crossed his arms. "There is only one flaw that I won't mimic, and that is epilepsy." She was stunned at that announcement, since it seemed that he already knew what he couldn't mimic, and she wondered about how he could specify that particular malady. She noticed she wasn't the only one wondering about that, since every time it asked the key question, "Why not epilepsy?" Almost as the question had been asked, she realized why he couldn't mimic that malady just as he said it. Many years ago, before my powers developed, I was diagnosed with epilepsy. It was likely that I would have it all my life, but remission is possible. She then noticed he was fidgeting a bit, as if what he was about to say was painful. However, if it appears that I'm going into an epileptic seizure, scan my mind. If there appears to be conflicting thoughts, it is a sign that a mutant has gotten too close, and their thoughts and powers are being forced on me. She glanced over at Angelo Espinosa as Angelo Espinosa made a low whistle. "Sounds painful, man. Having someone force their powers on you?" She was stunned when Richard looked right at Angelo and smiled. "Not as painful as what happens to someone who tries to pull a practical joke on me." She realized then that Angelo and Everett must have set up a surprise for the new student, but saw them relax when he continued. "However, the old bucket of water gag is a classic. I was trying to figure out what reaction you might have expected." She watched as the two boys now appeared to relax, but she was certain that she would speak with them later about this. Those thoughts left her mind when Franklin Richards, son of Reed and Susan Richards, spoke, reminding her that the boy was a student at the school. "What does it feel like when a mutant gets too close?" She watched as Richard put his hand to his head, as if demonstrating. "Well, it depends on the mutant. Most times it usually shows as a slight headache. In more extreme cases, it..." She was startled when he stopped speaking and collapsed to the floor. Soon he started to move in spasms, like he was having a seizure. Reacting right away, she scanned his mind and saw the various images now fighting for dominance. She couldn't tell what those images were, but she had a good idea whose they were. Penance had decided to show up, and right near the student.